Hi, this is Chef Sokol. On today's show, we're going to be talking about how to actually bake something. We're going to be baking 2 9-inch round cake layers, and we're going to be using the creaming method of mixing.
Welcome to Baking Radio. Learn the art and science of baking with author, educator, and award-winning chef, Chef Sokol. Whether you've been baking your whole life or you're brand new to the world of baking and you're looking to build your confidence and learn new skills in the kitchen, you're in the right place. This is Baking Radio.
First of all, when you bake cakes, you want to have a repertoire. So you want to be able to have go-tos. And this is my go-to yellow cake recipe that makes 2 beautiful 9-inch cake layers or one 9 by 13-inch rectangular cake if I want just a 1-layer cake. And you should also have a good chocolate cake recipe available to you. And if you have 2 recipes that are your go-tos, you can do anything you want with them. The world is your oyster. You can change the flavors, you can change the frostings, and you've got it made for any type of situation that you want a cake for. So the steps in making a cake using the creaming method of mixing starts with really room temperature butter. This is butter that you sort of stick your finger in it and the fingerprint sort of sticks. The indentation stays. It should be softened and not melted. So watch the microwaves. You think I'd have it out for microwaves, but microwaves can be very powerful and sometimes they can change the texture of the cake if your butter is melted. That'll be a different type of a cake. So the recipe I'm about to give you, and I'm actually going to give you this recipe. It's amazing. All right. I'm giving you all my tips about this recipe. It's going to be one of the most tender yellow cakes you've ever had. And it uses this mixing method known as the creaming method. So you take your softened butter, you put it into your electric mixer, and I add granulated sugar. So I'm going to be taking 1 stick of unsalted butter, which is exactly half a cup, and I'm going to be adding some sugar, granulated sugar, 1.5 cups. And you're going to let it go with your paddle attachment. Remember, if I say the word creaming, you should think paddle attachment, always. So you put your paddle attachment on and you go to maybe speed 4. All right, go slow, never go to the high speed first. Always go to speed 4. And you'll see that the paddle will go around and start mashing the butter against the sides of the bowl. The granulated sugar really helps for this because the granulated sugar almost acts like granules of sand and it pushes and pushes against that softened butter, and the butter would not be able to be pushed and prodded by the sugar if it wasn't softened. So this procedure would take a lot longer if the butter is cold, super cold, and you don't want that. So once you get your butter and sugar creamed, you'll see that the butter will turn white. And that means air has been forced into it. And that is a beautiful thing because those little air bubbles that are forced into your fat, those are going to work sort of in tandem with your chemical leaveners, your baking powder and baking soda, and they're going to enlarge the holes created with carbon dioxide gas bubbles. They're going to enlarge those bubbles, and they're going to create some incredibly tender, wonderful crumb to this cake. So once you have it creamed, and it will take several minutes, and there's a lot going on here, so you want to just sort of walk away from it for a few minutes. And I will tell you how important the creaming method is because I learned the hard way. Oh my goodness, have I got a story for you. So it really brings tears to my eyes about how important the creaming method is. And I learned this, and I'm going to tell you my story. It's very embarrassing to tell, but I'm going to tell it to you. My daughter was 5, and she wanted a dinosaur cake for her birthday. And I was quickly, easily able to oblige. I got myself a T-Rex cake pan. No problem, right? Perfect. It was greased and floured and ready to go. And I was in a hurry. Okay, I was in a hurry. So my butter was softened, but not probably enough. and I creamed the sugar with the butter, maybe a minute. I even knew I rushed it. I said, it'll be okay. Don't worry. Just keep going. You're in a hurry. I started adding my eggs, which is what you do during the creaming method. And then I started adding my other ingredients, and I baked this cake. And it looked like a dinosaur you had dug up in some sort of archaeological dig. It was flat, it was hard, and it hadn't risen. And I thought, oh my word, I mean, I'm a chef. This is embarrassing. This is humiliating. Now, I will tell you, I was alone at home. No one was there to listen, thank goodness. No one was there to hear my crying, because I really cried like a baby. I was so upset. And I said, what am I going to do with this cake? It barely came out of the pan. I dug it out of the pan, and I knew what I had to do. I said, I got to start over. I can't do this. So I took the cake. I sort of folded it into many pieces, wrapped it up. I tried it. It was good, but it was not the best it could be. Wrapped it in plastic wrap, threw it in the freezer, and I started again. So I put my butter at room temperature. I did it in the microwave. I was super careful this time. And I started thinking, what did I do? What did I do wrong? And I went through all my steps because I had made this cake numerous times. There was no reason for this to happen. I mean, this was an outright failure. This was an abomination, all right, on my part. And I knew I could do better. So I let the softened butter, once it did get softened, and the sugar, I creamed it and I let it go for probably 5 or 6 minutes. I said, let's see what happened. I rushed this. I remember I rushed this process. So I let it go, and I saw that the butter actually did turn white. The butter, and that's why I know it's turning white, because it got light. It got fluffy, really fluffy. When I stopped the machine, the electric mixer, and I scraped down the sides of the bowl with the electric, with my rubber spatula, I saw how light and fluffy it was. And I knew this did not happen the first time round. So I knew something was different. I proceeded to add my next several ingredients, my eggs, one at a time. Because when you're making a cake batter in this particular way, you're building what's known as an emulsion. So you're combining water-based ingredients that don't normally mix with fat-based ingredients. But you do it in an artful way that we call the creaming method of mixing, that they all stay together in the end in this beautiful, creamy concoction we call cake batter. So this was so different. And I said, wow, this batter was like triple the volume of the first one. And I hadn't even baked it yet. So I saw a big difference. It was thick. It was emulsified. The first one was sort of thin. Wasn't what I expected. But again, I was in a hurry. So I poured this batter into the pan, put it into the oven. You have no idea what a difference it was. This dinosaur came out about triple the volume. It was so puffed up and so high. It was a beautiful thing. That's when it dawned on me. I said, this creaming thing, this procedure that I always thought was like, you just do it for a minute or this really makes a difference. This is really something that you can mess up. And if you mess it up, you're going to have failure. Well, I took this cake out. I didn't tell anybody that this happened. It's just between you and me. But it was incredible. And a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, I've got to be teaching this to my students because this is amazing what this creaming process really does. So again, once you have your half a cup of butter or your 1 stick of butter, same thing, and you get it to room temperature and you add your 1.5 cups of sugar, granulated sugar, and you let that cream, you'll then add 2 large eggs, but one at a time. So crack those eggs into a liquid measuring cup so you have no shells. Just add one at a time. So whenever I see a yolk go over into the batter, I know I have 1 egg. Just pour until 1 yolk goes in. Let it mix. And that, you don't have to be so fancy about it. You just want it to incorporate. And then once that one egg is incorporated, add the next. And remember, our dry ingredients have already been mixed together. So this is really clearly part of the creaming method of mixing. You mix 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 3 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of double-acting baking powder, your leavening agent, 1 teaspoon of salt, and I usually use regular table salt. You can use kosher salt if you want, but I do find it can make a salty cake because some of the granules won't dissolve. So use your table salt, your smaller grain, and just whisk those dry ingredients together. Now, the next part of what I'm going to tell you, the next procedure, once you get your eggs in, you're going to be alternating dry and wet ingredients. And this is all part of the creaming method of mixing. So you begin to add 1/3 of your dry ingredients, your flour, baking powder, and salt, 1/3 of them. You've already mixed them. Just eyeball it. You don't have to go nuts. Just put 1/3 in. And you want to mix this on low speed. Because remember, flour contains proteins. Proteins form gluten. And gluten can create structure, which is fabulous, but can also create toughness. So we want to be careful of how quickly and how much we mix our cake batter once the flour is in. We can beat, the egg and the butter and the sugar all we want and as high as we want. That's not going to develop gluten. But once our flour is in, if you mix it, it will develop and become stronger. So once you add 1/3 of your dry ingredients, you'll then add 1/2 cup of milk plus 1.5 teaspoons of pure vanilla extract. And don't use the imitation stuff. It tastes like cough syrup. Use pure vanilla extract. So just add 1/2 cup of milk. So you're alternating dry and wet ingredients. After you add your milk and your vanilla, you'll let this mix for another minute. This is all done on low speed. You can even stop your machine and scrape down the sides of the bowl with a rubber spatula every so often, because you will see ingredients stick to your paddle and you will see ingredients stick to the side of the bowl. So stop your machine, just scrape it down, maybe clean off your paddle with your rubber spatula, and then continue. Next, because we already added some liquid, we're going to go back and add another 1/3 of our dry ingredients. We're going to mix them on low speed, followed by the remainder of the milk. And then we're going to do our grand finale and add the remainder of our flour, baking powder, and our salt. And at this point, you want to mix as little as possible, but you do want the ingredients to be thoroughly combined. At this point, you should have the most glorious, beautiful, almost looking like frosting type of a batter. It's going to be voluminous. It's going to be thick. It's going to be viscous. It's going to be gorgeous. And at this point, you're going to pour it, evenly divide it into your 2 round cake pans that you have prepped properly by greasing, flouring, parchmenting, if that is what you choose to do, and using parchment circles, and then greasing the top of those and flouring. You'll put your cake batter in, and don't use your rubber spatula to smooth the cake batter out. I have another tip for you. Take an offset spatula, a little one that has a rounded end to it. So it almost looks like a small, not sharp knife. There's no end to it. It's a rounded blade, and it has a little kink to it, a little bend at the end. And this will help you get into the pan and pretend that your cake pan is a clock, and pretend that your offset spatula is the hand in a clock. Could be the minute hand or the second hand, it doesn't matter. And you're going to go counterclockwise or clockwise. You're going to take the rounded end, go on one of the rounded edges of your cake pan, and just smooth ever so gently against the top layer of your cake batter, and this will smooth it down beautifully. And just put your cake pan in a circle, sort of turn it until the cake batter is completely smooth. And then remove that offset spatula and put it in the oven, and it will rise beautifully flat. You won't get any camel humps. You won't get any uneven layers or cracks. It'll bake beautifully. This will bake in a 350-degree oven for about 30 to 35 minutes. And one thing that a lot of people don't know, how do you tell when a cake is done? So it's been baking. Don't put it in for 35 minutes. Remember, I gave you a range, 30 to 35. Put it in for the minimum amount of time first. You can always adjust after. And you can always leave it in the oven to bake more, right? Once the cake is at 35 and let's say it gets overbaked, you can't take that and undo it. So always bake a little bit less. So at 30 minutes, you look at your cakes. They should be evenly risen. They should be brown. And the batter should have baked away from the sides of the cake pans. So you'll take one out, and basically there's 3 ways to tell if a cake is done. My first way is I take my finger, my nice clean finger, my index finger, and I just gently put it on top of the cake. Does my fingerprint spring back? Does that cake spring back? If it does, it tells me it's probably done. The next way I can tell is I take a small, sharp paring knife and I put it in, not like you're going to stab it to death, but you're just going to put one small knife blade in the center and pull it out slow. Do this slowly, and it should come out clean. If there's no batter attached to that knife, you're probably good to go, and that cake is done. The other way to tell is, has the batter baked away from the sides of the pan and formed like a crust? And I don't mean like a pie crust, but it will form a little bit of a crust. You'll see some browning there. That's how you know your cake is done. Gently take it out. Allow it to cool until it's barely warm. Don't take your cakes out of the pans when they're hot. And I'm going to repeat that because I know a lot of people that do that, and then their cakes split in half. So don't take it out when it's hot. Let it cool. Just be patient. Be patient. And one other thing while I'm at it. Before you take your cakes out of the oven, don't keep looking in the oven. I was actually on a radio show, and some woman called in and kept asking me why her banana bread never baked. And I asked her one question. I didn't know her. She lived across the country. I had never met this woman. I never saw her oven before. And I asked her one question. Do you have a window to your oven? And she said no. And I said, aha. Are you opening your oven many times before you take your banana bread out? And she goes, yeah, how did you know? I said, just a guess. So if you don't have a window and you know your oven is the proper temperature, don't open the oven. Once you open the oven, that hot air escapes. Remember, an oven is a hot box. And if you let that hot air come out and escape, your temperature drops immediately. So her banana bread took forever to bake. So once she stopped doing that, it baked in the time the recipe stated. Some recipes are, they're tested, and they're tested many times, but they're tested on specific ovens. Your oven may be different. Maybe you have super oven, and your cake is going to get done quicker. So you're going to look at the minimum amount of time that it takes to bake, but maybe you'll look even 5 minutes earlier than that. If you have a window, just look, turn the light on and take a look. If you see it's getting really brown, you may want to open your oven. But again, the majority of the baking process has already occurred. The baking time has already gone by. So your cake has risen, it has set in structure, and it has solidified enough that it's not going to fall and collapse. And that's what happens to a lot of people that don't leave their cakes in the oven long enough to bake. They actually collapse. And then they end up with a valley in the top of their cake. And sometimes it's very gummy because it's not done. So be sure you're baking your cakes for the proper amount of time and make sure that your ovens work properly. So what I always do, and I've always done before I ever start a professional job in a restaurant or in any type of a facility where there's a commercial kitchen, their kitchen Equipment can be abused and used many, many times over. I take my own thermometer. Bring an oven thermometer. Buy one in the grocery store. They're really cheap. And just keep it in your oven and see if the oven is coming up to temperature. Many ovens will heat things in cycles, and sometimes the oven temperature will seem a little bit too low or a little too high. But usually over time, it's about where you want it to be. If it's an old oven, you may want to make sure you get it recalibrated, or better yet, get a new oven. But you really want to make sure that your oven is at the proper temperature. All right, so your cake is baked. It's cooled, because we've talked so much, it's cooled down already, right? Now you're ready to remove it. So you've removed it, and you've put it on cake circles or a plate, and you're not ready to frost it yet because your frosting isn't done. So you're going to wait until it's completely cold. Remember, it's still going to maintain some heat in that cake pan. So you want to let it cool until it's completely cooled. I didn't say cold. I'm not saying cold. I'm saying cooled, because frosting will melt on a warm cake. Make sure that cake is really cooled, and then you can proceed with your frosting. So we learned how to bake 2 9-inch round cake layers using the creaming method of mixing, and I gave you my favorite yellow cake recipe. If you didn't have a chance to write it down, go to bakingradio.com and you can get that recipe. And next show, I can't wait, we're going to learn how to frost a 2-layer cake.